Action. What's up, guys? It's episode 8 of Counterculture. This is the pre-show. What's up, Counterculture? Episode 8. I'm your host, Aaron Lujan. This is the interwebs. This is my 8th episode of Counterculture. And I'm going to start over because I wasn't recording the podcast. Let's start over. Pretend you didn't see that. Nobody's watching, so it doesn't matter. Welcome. Today is March 26, 2017. This is episode 8 of Counterculture. I'm your host, Aaron Lujan. I'm broadcasting thousands of feet above sea level at the peak of the Rocky Mountains, just a few miles away from Pikes Peak. I'm joshing around on the interwebs and the information superhighway trying to get some information out today. It's Sunday, it's fun day, it's time to be weird, it's time to be crazy, it's time to get a little offensive, it's time to get a little hateful. We're going to be talking about truth is the new hate speech. I was driving in Denver the other day and the guy had a big billboard on his yard that said, truth is the new hate speech. So I said, gosh golly, I'm going to use that as my title for my podcast. It's been a while. If you guys are listening, thanks for joining me. You and the 3 other people who listen, I'm not making fun of myself, it's just the truth. But one day there will be billions tuning in to this information. So let's just get into it, guys. I pretty much spent most of my Sunday thinking about researching through this idea that truth is the new hate speech. And we see a movement today, if you've been paying attention to the news, there's a movement to classify a certain type of free speech as quote-unquote hate speech, quote-unquote offensive speech. And we're seeing that in recent news reported by The Verge and many others. AT&T, Verizon, and other major advertisers are pulling dollars away from the Alphabet company, aka Google, YouTube, because they don't want their ads running alongside, quote, offensive content. I can understand that. I'm an advertiser. I don't want my advertisement to come before ISIS chopping off heads. Totally get that. But there's this idea that rings through my head that gives me pause, which is this idea known as order out of chaos, problem, reaction, solution. This strategy, this historical strategy of you create a problem and then you pose as the savior and you provide the solution. So it's an old strategy of being able to seize power and get things done. So I'm concerned that this may be the case because in this article it talks about that Google will be instituting a new software program that I'm not going to be able to tell you because my internet freezes and I don't have a producer. But essentially what it does is it flags certain content that users have identified as quote-unquote toxic. Actually, that was the word that Google used. And initially they say it's not going to affect search results, it's not going to push down certain articles, but it will identify certain content as toxic or offensive because of this boycott. So in addition to that, we also have AT&T and Verizon pulling ads from YouTube. I kind of just merged those 2 news articles together, so forgive me. There's 2 separate news pieces. There's one where AT&T and Verizon is pulling ads from YouTube because they do not want their ads appearing before offensive content. The other article is Google is flagging offensive content. And we're already seeing some of that happen in the form of an article that was reported by Natural News. And this is titled, Google's Outrageous Censorship of Natural News Continues. Natural News is a natural health website. And essentially they have been, a lot of their articles have been delisted or scrubbed from Google. So if you search for natural smoothies for breakfast, the Natural News articles pointing to that awesome recipe will be purged, amongst other serious things. Well, not purged, but I guess flagged. Well, in this case, they've already claimed that they've been removed. We're seeing this also take place in Germany. Germany is already persecuting hate speech online. Apparently, there were police raids that took place back in 2016 of July. The Verge article titled "German Police Raid Homes Over Facebook Hate Speech. Operation Targeted 60 People Accused of Posting Far-Right Content to a Private Facebook Group." And Germany's on the roll because most recently, also The Verge is reporting Germany considers 50 million euro fines for social media companies that fail to remove hate speech. So we're seeing governments put pressure on private companies. We're seeing advertisers like Verizon and AT&T put pressure on the largest marketing firm, which is the Alphabet company, which owns Google and YouTube. And most interesting to me is a article in Breitbart, United Nations regulating hate speech, not an attack on free speech. I'm not a fan of Breitbart, but I will say that it is true that the United Nations marked the International Day for Elimination of Racial Discrimination on Tuesday by telling governments around the world that regulating, quote, hate speech is part of the strategy needed to stand up for, quote, or needed to, quote, stand up for someone's rights. So the United Nations is chiming in and saying that they support censorship and that this stuff is all good in the hood. So what is hate speech? I mean, what would be considered a definition of hate speech? Well, let's just go with the current flavors of today. Racism, misogyny, quote-unquote gay rights, these obscure interpretations of misogyny, a refusal to ascribe gays as a protected class. In this age of identity politics, we're saying that anytime that you express racism, which I personally think is bad, and I say that reluctantly because it's obviously bad. There's a lot of things that are bad, but there's such a focus put on racism in particular. However, this is what they're focusing on is specifically racism, specifically misogyny, specifically people who do not embrace a quote-unquote gay rights agenda. And the reason why I say obscure is because racism is attributed to comments and behavior and attitudes that typically in a traditional definition wouldn't be racism. For example, positions that reflect nationalism. If you are strong on the borders and you say something like, I believe that we should close our borders, or we should build a wall, or we should vet refugees from the Middle East, from countries who declare or are declaring jihad, many of those people are being accused of racism. Have you heard of people who support Trump being called racist? So we're seeing racism, which is being considered hate speech, appropriated to nationalists, to people who are pro-immigration, to people who support or continue to support Donald Trump. So my question is, who gets to define hate speech today? Because if you were to define hate speech along those lines, anybody who is a nationalist, anybody who is for sovereignty or border enforcement, immigration enforcement, is considered committing acts of hate speech. Ask the Pakistani Muslims. This is actually an interesting article addressing this idea of who gets to define hate speech. The BBC News has an article, March 17th, Pakistan asked Facebook to help fight blasphemy. So if you're in Pakistan, we could define hate speech as anybody who is in contradiction with the Quran. Continuing, who gets to define hate speech? Well, if you ask a Canadian mayor, let's go to the article. This is out of weaselzippers.us. Canadian mayor criticizing Muslim prayer is hate speech. So if you're critical of Muslim prayer, that's considered hateful. You may agree with me, you may disagree with me, but let's continue to go down the line. If you ask a principal of a school in the United States, saying the word Trump is actually considered hate speech. Let's go to the article. So this is actually from the Independent Journal Review, and this is actually out of, bear with me guys, my computer always chooses to freeze in the middle of a live broadcast. So I'm not able to tell you who that principal is, but Independent Journal Review, students chant Trump at high school basketball game and then apologizes. Here we go. Canton High School chanted Donald Trump slogans at their rivals' classical magnet school during the game Tuesday. Students chanted Trump, 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 and held up Trump campaign signs during the game. And apparently the school came out and said that is hate speech. You cannot chant the word of the freely elected president of the United States. Continuing. A recent WorldNet Daily article, libertarian author shouted down for hate speech. College students chant racist, sexist, anti-gay, Charles Murray, go away. Apparently this author never really specifically said anything that would be classically defined as racism or sexist. He's a libertarian who believes that governments should be small and should stay out of your personal business. But he was shouted down by dozens of students holding up signs and calling him hateful and engaging in hate speech. So you obviously see the problem. Who gets to define hate speech? Well, if it's defined as anybody whose feelings are hurt, or who can claim that their feelings have been hurt, the person who's speaking the words that cause the pain, I guess, would be guilty of hate speech, which I find interesting because when you actually study the true definition of racism, which is discriminating or speaking poorly against someone because of their race, or if you were to define misogyny as treating a person of the other gender unfairly because of their gender, that would be typical misogyny. Well, you actually have a epidemic in this country where black people in the United States are unproportionately targeted for murder. The United States legally has murdered unproportionally millions of blacks, more than whites, in what we now call abortion. And whether you think it's okay to kill babies or not, or if you choose to believe that it's not human life and you ascribe to some philosophy with regards to that, one thing you cannot deny is that African Americans, blacks, are unproportionally targeted in abortion. So if blacks make up less than, say, 15% of the population, but represent over 30 or 40% of all abortions, I would consider that racially motivated, and that's true racism, but you don't hear that at all. So the classical definition of racism within the context of abortion, nobody seems to be concerned with that. We can also talk about the welfare state and how the black and Hispanic communities have a high number of single parent households and have a higher percentage, what's up, Yvonne? And have a higher percentage of, they have a higher percentage of single moms who are basically signed up for welfare. So that would actually be another example of racism if you wanted to consider the welfare state. Female genital mutilation. You're a woman and your genitals should be mutilated just because you're a woman. That's actually happening in dozens of countries right now in the world, but yet nobody really seems to be standing up for those women. To me, that's very misogynistic. Or the way that people who ascribe to a homosexual lifestyle, whether you agree or disagree with that, they're being stoned and thrown off roofs in other countries. But nobody seems to be calling out anti-gay when that happens. I would think that if you're gay and a bunch of people throw you off a roof and say we're throwing you off the roof because you're gay, that's a act of hatred. So we've gone beyond speech. We're now engaged in hateful, violent acts because of people's sexual orientation or race. But yet nobody seems to want to discuss the actual expression of that speech, the actual violent act of somebody acting out on their hatred. No, they want to say that if you are pro-Trump, or that if you believe in traditional family and if family is between one man and one woman, then that's racism or misogyny or that's anti-gay. And I simply think that that's just ridiculous. Now, what's even more interesting is that in the United States, we actually have actual examples of people expressing racism. For example, Lena Dunham, who's I guess she's the creator of a popular television show, Girls, amongst other things, has said, extinction of white men would lead to evolution of better men. Nobody came out, from what I could see, and made a big fuss about her being misogynistic towards men. Because again, misogyny isn't just towards women, it's towards another gender. The current chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Tom Perez, has I'm sorry, no, not Tom Perez. Tom Perez is the DNC chair, but there was a candidate campaigning to be the DNC chair, said, it is, quote, my job to shut down other white people. No disgust with that comment. Tom Perez, the current head of the Democratic Party, said it is my bad. That was not Tom Perez that said that. That was the DNC chair. I'll get to Tom Perez here in a second. This is actually out of the SGT report. He thinks that white people shouldn't be able to vote. Can you imagine if the head of the Republican Party came out and said black people shouldn't be allowed to vote? Okay, well, guess what? Tom Perez said that. Tom Perez is the head of the DNC. I do not make this up. SGT report. White people are not entitled to protection under the Voting Rights Act. End quote. Nobody got upset. Nobody called for his resignation. Clearly, that's would be an example of hate speech because of the color of your skin. You shouldn't be allowed to vote. But nobody said anything about that. The University of California, Davis, in a recent university guide, claims that only white people can be racist. And this was actually printed on an official document by the University of California, Davis. The editor of Teen Vogue tweeted, all white people are evil. Not a big deal at all. Again, because we live in this society where it looks like only certain groups of people get to define what is hate speech. And apparently it's only hate speech and it's only racist if it's targeted towards a non-white person. So if it's only a non-white person who's the object of the racism, then it's only racism, even though that defies the definition of racism, because the definition of racism doesn't specify the color. It's just being treated unfairly due to your race, the color of your skin, your national origin, or your ethnicity. But that doesn't matter to the people. And the reason why I'm podcasting, guys, is I want to be able to think about these things together, because when we get bombarded by this weaponized media system, a lot of times we fall into these unspoken thoughts and constructs. And I want to unconstruct that through common sense and reasoning, because if somebody says something like white people shouldn't vote and all white people are racist and or no, white people cannot be racist, or only white people can be racist and all white people are evil and all these ridiculous things, we should call it racist, but we're not, and I find that very, very troubling. So the last one I wanted to share with you guys, which was actually, to me, one of the more concerning ones, was actually a woman on Twitter. So supposedly, as I mentioned earlier, Google's setting up all these, protocols. There's all this concern, for community guidelines and making sure that people don't speak hatefully. Just recently, a woman on Twitter said, hunt and kill all white women. and actually specifically said, and I'll quote her on Twitter, she tweeted, and this is from March 24th, 2017. Well, she actually tweeted this March 23rd, 2017. White women should be hunted and killed. Then we won't get white babies who think they own the world. This is what this woman said, and it was not taken down by Facebook. I think I mentioned Twitter, and I think I said tweeted, so forgive me. It's only my 8th podcast. Give me a break. Just kidding. It was reported by Facebook as a violation of terms and services, and it was not taken down. So, what the heck? So, on one hand, we have this chorus of people and media and institutions saying racism, misogyny, hate speech, offensive content. Let's have Google flag all the offensive content, and let's have Facebook start, removing things, and let's watch what we say. And then on the other hand, actually have it happen and nobody says anything, but then express a ridiculous, perverted definition of it, like I'm pro-borders and I want refugees to be vetted, and then that somehow seems to now being pointed to as hateful and offensive. So I don't think we're being consistent here. I think we're seeing free speech under attack if you're doing the math. So if you guys haven't noticed, the problem here is, what is the definition of hate speech? Who gets to define hate speech? Well, can I get to define hate speech? Because I have my own definition and one that I stand by. So let's go. I find free speech from Hollywood offensive. I find Madison Avenue, which is another way of describing the advertising industry, all your television commercials, all of your billboards, all of the cover of your magazine articles, your radio, your internet advertisements. I find a lot of that stuff offensive. Let me explain. I think it's more offensive to assault others' dignity and others' sensibilities and assault the innocence of innocent children than to hurt the feelings of a person because they're a part of a race or a gender. For example, let me explain. So, I'm obviously a brown man. I'm obviously a person of color. And I am continuously and regularly meeting people of other ethnicities, primarily Anglo people. I can count on my hand the times where I can honestly say, wow, I was just treated a certain way because of racism. And even if I wasn't, or even if I was and I didn't notice, who cares, right? Because if I was treated poorly because of my race and I didn't even notice it, it doesn't matter. But let's take the example. Let's assume that I'm really, fragile and sensitive, because I actually am. And somebody says something to me that's racist, like, go back to Mexico, wetback. Well, I could get my feelings hurt and be like, man, he called me a wetback and he says that I should go back to Mexico, and because I look and am a part of a group of people that identify as Hispanic or Mexican American, and he hates me because I'm a part of that group. So I guess now I'm supposed to be sad, I'm supposed to be hurt. You guys, I mean, I don't know if I'm an anomaly, but that doesn't bother me, and I'm not saying that to sound politically correct. So allow me to explain this intellectually to you, why this doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me because I'm being hated for being a member, and when I say member, it's identity politics, but let's go with it anyways. I'm being hated and being treated unfairly, or being attacked, or being accused, or being whatever, hatefully treated, spoken to hatefully, being offended by someone because I'm a part of a group of millions of people that are identified by a region of the world they're from and by a language that they speak. That doesn't bother me. That's millions of people. That doesn't indict me. I'm not insecure about who I am or where I come from. As it doesn't many people. I'm sure, just think about yourself. If you're an Anglo person, if you're an Asian person, if you're a black person, if you're a white person, if you're a Hispanic person, do you really take offense for someone who obviously has a problem, someone who's hateful, being mean to you because you're a part of a lot of people? Now, I'll tell you what would bother me, though. If somebody made fun of me because I can't podcast and my computer freezes. And I'm being honest, I'm being serious. It would actually bug me a little bit more because it's an indictment of me personally, or my personal inability to do something. I am ineffective, and so that's a reflection on me. So that would actually be something that I would have a hard time battling, because that is an accusation on me. And they're saying, you are bad at podcasting, or you're bad at, working on cars, or you're bad at whatever. So the point I'm trying to make is, why does racism bother people? Like, it's not a personal attack on you. But assuming that it is a bad thing, let's play the comparative game. Racism or assaulting the innocence of innocent children. Earlier I asked, can I get to identify what free speech is? Okay. Well, you know what I find offensive? I find it offensive that if I go to the movies to watch the new Beauty and the Beast by Disney, and there's a scene where two male characters are kissing, they're actually pushing homosexuality on my children. Now, I actually have a problem with heterosexuality being pushed on my children, but I have more of a problem, and again, we're talking who gets to define hate speech, or offensive content. I'm going to say that it's very offensive to sexualize my child, my daughters, and wickedly do so in a Disney movie by having a part of the plot, a love connection with two men, and then there's a kissing at the end of what's supposed to be a children's movie. That's offensive, Disney. That's offensive. You know what else is offensive? It's offensive when I turn on my smart TV and I end up on my Roku homepage and I have to turn my daughter's eyes away or cover her eyes because HBO and Showtime and all these other networks choose to put half-naked people and violence and horror and demonic things on my screen as a advertisement or icon to click on their channel. I find that offensive. I also find it offensive to go to Nordstrom's rack and see a full-grown man wearing makeup and mascara and lipstick and a little stupid skirt, and he's a man, and I gotta go home and have to hear my daughter ask me, Papa, why does that man wear makeup? And explain to her that some people are screwed up in the brain. That's offensive to me. It's offensive when I'm in public and I have grown adults cursing and using profanities in front of my 1.5-year-old girl. That's offensive. You know what's hateful? Murdering millions of babies just because they're black and putting Planned Parenthoods in black and Hispanic neighborhoods and killing Hispanic babies and black babies. That's hate. You know, it's not even hateful. It's acts of hate. It's murder. That's the ultimate expression of hate. Hate in its ultimate manifestation is murder. And they're doing it to our babies because they're black and because they're Mexican. And you look at the statistics, do your research. The Planned Parenthood and abortion facilities are in the hood with the blacks and the Mexicans. But you're not going to hear politicians, especially Democratic ones, saying, oh, let's protect the blacks who are being murdered by Planned Parenthood with taxpayer dollars. You're not going to hear that. No. You're going to hear somebody who voted for Trump. Oh, he's racist because he voted for Trump. So I find it offensive to not be decent in public. I find it offensive. I find it hateful to kill all these kids. You know what's not a big deal? Getting your feelings hurt because someone says something about your race or gender. So it becomes pretty confusing, right, guys, when we try to say, well, who gets to define hate speech and offensive? Because if you take my definition, you're probably not going to like it if I were to actually argue for that man to not be able to wear makeup outside. Why? Because he has a free speech, right? He has the right to express himself however he wants, and nobody can tell him not to. So you know what I have to do? I have to suck it up and live in this society and explain to my daughters. And I got a newsflash for you. I'm not sitting here on this podcast calling to include what I just defined as offensive and hateful to be under that definition and then also be censored by Google, Facebook, and ultimately the governments of this country like Germany has already begun doing. I'm not calling for that. You know why I'm not calling for that? Because when you live in a free society, the exchange or the trade-off is getting your feelings hurt, snowflake, getting offended, getting hurt, going home and being, man, that guy just called me a bad name. Or, you know what, that guy just expressed an opinion like that I disagree with. But you know what? I have to live in a society where he's able to express what he says, even though I think it's wrong. Like when I see somebody like this guy Savage, who's a quote-unquote sex blogger, whatever it is. I think his name's Michael Savage. This guy describes in gross detail homosexual acts on television and on video. And you know what? It is disgusting and it's abhorrent. I find it offensive. But you know what? He's not making any threats. So I want his free speech protected, even though I find it disgusting, even though I disagree with it, even though I think this guy has no business saying what he's saying because he's just speaking wickedness. I stand by his right to do it because I don't want to live in a society where we limit people's free speech. So I got an idea. Rather than letting and trying to figure out who gets to decide what's offensive and who gets to decide what's hate speech, why don't we just protect free speech like the founders did and enshrine it in our Constitution? It's actually the First Amendment. It's the most important right that we have as U.S. citizens, is the ability to speak freely. So I would argue it's better to get your feelings hurt and be free than to be insulated and coddled and lose the ability to speak your mind. The proponents of limiting free speech in the name of hate and offensive content have no legitimacy because their hypocrisy is astounding. And I just expose them for it. If I call you names and call you racist things and call you racial things and call you misogynistic things, guess what? Deal with it. And I can say it on the internet and I can say it to your face because it's constantly protected. But you know what? I'm not going to, because I personally don't believe in those things. But if you believe in those things, you have the right to say those things. But I got a deal for you. Let me say whatever I want to say so long as I'm not inciting violence, because I have the right to do so. The free speech is a law that's protected by the government because the role of government is only to protect our God-given liberties. And the United States is one of those few countries that actually is built that way. Try doing that in North Korea. Try doing that in Cuba. Try doing that in Venezuela. Try even doing that in Mexico. They find heads beheaded all the time and bodies in acid vats and beheaded heads in duffel bags and you name it in Mexico, with journalists trying to expose the fact that their government is run by narcos and carteles. George Washington said, if men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter which may involve the most serious and alarming consequences that can invite the consideration of mankind, reason is of no use to us. The freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. Ben Franklin said, freedom of speech is a principal pillar of a free government. When this support is taken away, the constitution of a free society is dissolved, and tyranny is erected on its ruins. Republics and limited monarchies derive their strength and vigor from a popular examination into the action of the magistrates. James Madison, founding father, said, I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by the violent and sudden usurpations. Benjamin Franklin also said, whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. The last thing I just want to leave with you guys is an article that just came out by a guy in Asia somewhere. Let's see exactly where he's from. Oh, my bad. Before I do that, March 2nd, 2017, CBN News titled, The Bible is Criminal. British court convicts preachers. You had some preachers preaching the Bible. They were thrown in jail. This year, guys, in the UK, for preaching the Bible. If you guys know your history, the West was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, with the first speech protecting people to not practice religion if they don't want to, and to hate God if they want to, or to not believe that God exists if they want to, but most importantly, to protect people that if they want to worship a false God, or if they want to worship the one true God, they can do so because they're free people and they have the right. And that's what the free speech is actually about. But looking over across the pond, apparently it's not going that way anymore. They're throwing preachers in jail for preaching the Bible, guys. If you're not paying attention, it's coming into the U.S. So the last article that I promised I wanted to share with you is actually not in front of me, of course. There's a blogger in a country in Asia, and his name I have here is Lee Yu. He was very critical of Islam, very critical of Christianity, very critical of religion. Now, I actually happen to personally disagree with him, at least on the Christian part. But he attacked my faith, and he did it in his country. And the government wanted to jail him. And he got asylum, refugee asylum, into the United States. And the question that was raised in this article is, are we doing the right thing, essentially? Should we be giving asylum to refugees who are critical of religion? And I find this very interesting because I'm going to assume that the reason why the article was questioning this and why their governments wanted to persecute him was because he was being critical of Islam. He was in a country that was very militant in their Islamic culture, and he was very critical of it. And now the article is saying, you know, is the United States actually rewarding hate speech? That was the title of the article. Is the United States awarding hate speech? That's just crazy. I mean, it's like we're walking in reverse. We're driving down the freeway in reverse at 65 miles an hour trying to maneuver this. This is ridiculous. Is the United States rewarding hate speech with asylum? The United States was always a refuge for people being persecuted and fleeing from persecution, specifically religious persecution. The country was founded on people fleeing from religious persecution. In 2017, we're asking, are we rewarding hate speech, which is what they're calling people who are being critical of religious persecution? So this is where we're at today, guys. The point I'm trying to make is that if we allow certain groups of people to identify what hate speech and offensive content is, we lose everything. If we lose free speech, we lose everything. It was the First Amendment for a reason. It's the most important. We need to defend it at all costs. So that's it, guys. I've gone long enough. Thank you for listening. Today is March 26, 2017. You were listening to episode 8 of Counterculture. This was the first live broadcast. Please share it if you guys think it was good. And just go to aaronlujan.com, AARONLUJAN.com for all of my videos and podcasts. I'm just going to be up here on till they physically take me down. Peace out.